had $32 million sitting quietly in accounts that nobody in my family knew existed. But my own son looked at me and saw nothing but a liability. He saw a retired man in a worn flannel shirt who drove a 12-year-old pickup truck and clipped grocery coupons on Sunday mornings. He saw someone to be managed, not respected, someone to be tolerated until it was no longer convenient. His wife saw even less. She saw a problem that needed a solution. I sat across from them at their own dinner table for 3 years and watched them pour their affection onto a man who had never built anything honest in his life, while they treated me like I was already halfway in the ground. They did not know that the commercial properties generating rent checks every month in 4 provinces belonged to me. They did not know that the industrial warehouse complex outside Edmonton, the strip mall in Mississauga, the self-storage facility in Kelowna, all of it traced back to a holding company called RVF Properties, and RVF stood for nothing more poetic than Raymond Victor Fraser. That is my name. And the day my son stood up in a bankruptcy and insolvency courtroom in Toronto and told a federal trustee that his father was a confused old pensioner with no meaningful assets, I walked through those doors and introduced myself properly for the first time in 40 years. Before I tell you what happened when they finally saw who I was, please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that dignity is not something a man surrenders just because his children stopped seeing it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. My name is Raymond Fraser. I am 67 years old. I was born in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, the son of a coal miner who taught me 2 things: that the land beneath your feet is the only thing that does not lie to you, and that a quiet man is never an empty man. I moved to Toronto at 22 with $400 and a mechanical engineering certificate. I spent the first decade working construction management, learning how buildings were put together and, more importantly, how they were financed. I bought my first commercial property at 31 with every dollar I had saved, and a mortgage that kept me awake more nights than I can count. By the time my son was born, I had 3 properties. By the time he started high school, I had 11. I did not advertise this. I drove the same truck. I wore the same boots. My late wife Margaret understood. She said that wealth worn on the outside attracts people who want to eat it, not grow it. She was the wisest person I ever knew. When she passed from cancer 8 years ago, something shifted in my son. He had always been comfortable, never hungry, never worried. Margaret and I had made sure of that, but after she was gone, he stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a resource. It happened slowly, the way rust takes a bridge. You do not notice until the structure starts to give. My son is 38. I will call him by the name his mother chose, Daniel. He works in financial consulting, which in his case meant packaging other people's money into investments he barely understood and collecting a commission when it went sideways. He lives in a new build in Oakville with his wife, a woman I will call Renata, who had converted her Instagram account into what she described as a lifestyle brand 3 years ago and had managed to accumulate 40,000 followers and a personality composed entirely of aesthetic choices. They had been together for 5 years. I had tried, genuinely tried, to build something with Renata. She was sharp, she was driven. But she viewed me the way a landlord views a tenant who is 2 months behind, as a problem with a deadline. The man who changed everything arrived in my son's life about 2 years before the courtroom. His name was Gordon Ashby. He had a voice like a radio announcer and a background that changed every time someone asked about it. He described himself as a private equity architect, a phrase that meant absolutely nothing to me but apparently meant everything to Daniel. Gordon drove a Range Rover that I later discovered was leased under a numbered company in Alberta. He wore French cufflinks and talked about deal flow and capital velocity and generational leverage as though he were reciting scripture. Daniel treated him like a prophet. The first time I met Gordon was at a Thanksgiving dinner at Daniel's house in Oakville. I drove up in my truck and parked in the street because the driveway was full. Renata opened the door and looked past me immediately, scanning the driveway the way you check a room for someone more interesting. She stepped aside to let me in and said, "Raymond, you found it," as though my house had not been in the same city for 6 years, and as though the invitation had not come 3 days late by text message. The dining room had been rearranged. The chair at the head of the table, where I had sat every year since they moved into the house, was now occupied by Gordon Ashby, who was holding forth about infrastructure REITs in the same tone a man uses when he expects to be recorded. Daniel was beside him, nodding with the eagerness of a student who has finally found the teacher he deserved. I was directed to a seat at the far end, beside the kitchen pass-through. Every time someone opened the oven, I got a face full of hot air and the smell of burnt edges. I sat down and said nothing. I watched Gordon perform. He talked about a development opportunity in Northern Ontario, a resort and wellness corridor near Parry Sound that he claimed was positioned to capture the post-pandemic retreat economy. He said the projected returns were between 40% and 60% over 36 months. He said the window was closing. He said only the people in this room were being offered the ground floor. He said all of this while carving turkey with the confidence of a man who had never once been wrong. Daniel watched him with open admiration. At one point, Gordon gestured in my direction and said, "Even the old guard could tell you that land near the shield never loses value." He smiled when he said it. Not at me. Past me. As though I were a prop he was using to make a point. Renata laughed, a rehearsed sound. She looked at me and said to the table, "Raymond's more of a saver than an investor, aren't you? He still has an account at the same credit union he opened in 1980-something. People smiled politely. I took a bite of my turkey. I did not tell them that the credit union account held $14,000 and that it was the only account in my name they would ever find if they went looking. I did not tell them about the numbered companies. I did not tell them about the holding structures my accountant Margaret had spent 20 years helping me build. I did not tell them that I had been to Parry Sound 2 months earlier and had quietly asked around about Gordon Ashby's so-called resort corridor. What I found was a parcel of Crown land with restricted development access, a dead-end permit application, and 2 angry investors in Barrie who had each put in $75,000 and had not received a single progress update in 14 months. I said nothing. I was there to observe. After dinner, Daniel followed me to my truck. He shoved his hands in his jacket pockets the way he used to when he was a teenager about to ask me for something he already knew I would question. He said Gordon had extended a very limited partnership opportunity. He said the minimum buy-in was $50,000. He said it was the kind of thing that only came along once. I looked at my son in the cold October dark outside his house in Oakville, and I told him that I had looked into Gordon Ashby's project near Parry Sound, and that I believed it was not what it appeared to be. I told him I was concerned. Daniel's face changed. He stepped back, and the warmth he had been performing all evening evaporated. He told me that I did not understand modern capital structures. He told me that my way of thinking, buying buildings and collecting rent, was the financial equivalent of keeping money under a mattress. He told me Gordon had an MBA from Western and connections across Bay Street. He told me I was holding him back because I was afraid of being left behind by people who were smarter than me. He said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse. He said it the way you correct a child who has embarrassed you in public. I told him good night. I drove home. In the morning I called my solicitor, a woman named Patricia Chen who had been handling my affairs for 15 years, and I told her to begin building a separate legal entity. I told her I wanted a numbered company structured for property acquisition registered federally. I told her to call it 44RF Holdings. Patricia asked me what the acquisition target was. I told her to be patient. I had a feeling about where this was going, and I wanted the right vehicle ready when it arrived. The next 8 months gave me more information than I wanted. Gordon Ashby had inserted himself into my son's financial life the way a vine grows into a foundation, slowly, quietly, and with catastrophic structural results. Daniel had invested the $50,000 from a line of credit secured against his home equity. He had then introduced Gordon to 4 colleagues, each of whom had put in similar amounts. In return, Gordon had made Daniel a junior partner in the venture, which gave him a small monthly stipend and a title on the letterhead that made him feel important. Renata had launched what she called a collaboration with Gordon's corporate brand on her Instagram. She was posting content about the resort development, showing architectural renderings that Gordon had commissioned from a freelancer in Bangalore. The renderings were beautiful. They showed cedar lodges and infinity pools overlooking the granite cliffs of the Shield, They showed exactly what the site could never legally become. I know this because I hired a land use planner to review the lot's zoning and permit history. The report took 3 weeks. When I read it, I understood that Gordon was not just incompetent. He knew exactly what the land could not do. He had purchased the parcel cheap specifically because it was restricted, because it looked impressive on paper and meant nothing in practice. He was selling the idea of a development to collect investor money, pay himself a management fee, and hold the whole thing together long enough to disappear. I did not go to Daniel with this information. I had tried once. I was not going to beg. Instead, I called Patricia and told her to identify the institution holding the mortgage on Daniel's home in Oakville. It was a mid-sized trust company with a commercial lending arm that had been aggressive in its residential portfolio. Patricia made inquiries. The mortgage was a 5-year fixed term, 3 years in, with an outstanding balance of just under $400,000. In addition to the original mortgage, Daniel had taken a home equity line of credit of $120,000, much of which had already been drawn down. The loan was not performing well. The trust company had flagged it internally for review. Patricia came back to me with a number. I wrote a check from 44RF Holdings. The trust company sold us the note within 2 weeks. I was now holding the debt on my son's house. I did not call him. I went about my life. I drove my truck to the diner on Dundas where I had breakfast every Thursday with my old friend Barry, who had worked with me on my first construction project 40 years ago and who was one of 3 people alive who knew what I was actually worth. I ordered my eggs with whole wheat toast. I drank my coffee. I watched the snow start to fall outside the window, and I thought about my son and the man he had become. And I felt grief the way you feel it when something has been dying so slowly. You cannot name the exact moment it was lost. The collapse of Gordon Ashby's resort project did not arrive quietly. It arrived the way a pipe bursts in winter, all at once, with water everywhere. A journalist at a regional business publication in Northern Ontario had been following a complaint filed with the Ontario Securities Commission about an unregistered investment vehicle near Parry Sound. The story ran on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, Gordon's phone was not answering. By the following Monday, 2 of the investors Daniel had recruited were calling lawyers. Daniel spent 4 days trying to reach Gordon. He left messages. He sent emails. He showed up at the office address Gordon had given him, which turned out to be a shared workspace on King Street, where Gordon had maintained a hot desk membership he had canceled 6 weeks earlier. Gordon Ashby was not in Toronto. He was not in Northern Ontario. His Range Rover was found at Pearson International in the long-term lot, the lease company's problem now. He had moved the bulk of the investor funds through 3 shell companies and out of the country in stages over the previous 2 months. He had left behind nothing but a Canva-designed website and a LinkedIn profile that had been deactivated. Daniel was not just a victim. He was a recruiter. 4 people had lost money partly because he had vouched for Gordon. One of them was a colleague who had used his RRSP contribution room to invest, a decision that could not be undone without penalty. That colleague had already spoken to an employment lawyer. Daniel was facing civil exposure. His income had not recovered from the commission drought of the previous year. The HELOC was nearly maxed. Renata had been spending as though the resort was already built, the credit cards accumulating a balance that now exceeded $30,000. The monthly carrying costs on the house were becoming unsustainable. I watched all of this through the lens of the property management alerts on my phone, the same ones that tell me when a mortgage account goes into arrears. When Daniel missed his first payment to 44RF Holdings, I received a notification at 6:43 in the morning. I was already awake. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, reading the paper the same way I had every morning for 30 years. I set down my cup. I looked at the notification. I did not call my son. I waited. He missed the second payment. On the 35th day after the first missed payment, Patricia sent the required notice under the terms of the mortgage agreement. It was a formal demand letter. It went out by registered mail to the Oakville address. It was on plain legal letterhead. The creditor was listed as 44RF Holdings, a federal numbered company with a registered address at Patricia's office. Daniel received it on a Tuesday. I know this because my phone rang at 7:15 that same evening. I was watching the hockey game. I let it ring. He called again at 7:42. I let it ring again. He left a voicemail that was composed in equal parts of panic and aggression. He said the mortgage company was clearly making an error. He said he had documentation proving the account was current. He said he would have his lawyer contact them in the morning. He said nobody was going to push his family out of their home over a clerical mistake. I saved the voicemail. The situation escalated the way financial situations always do when people refuse to accept the arithmetic. Daniel hired a lawyer, a young man from a discount firm on Young Street whose name I will not use. The lawyer sent a letter to Patricia alleging procedural irregularities in the mortgage assignment and demanding documentation. Patricia responded within 48 hours with a complete chain of title, the assignment agreement, and a 10-page chronology of the payment arrears. The lawyer went quiet for 11 days. Then Daniel himself appeared. He drove to my street on a Tuesday evening in November and knocked on my door, the same door he had not knocked on in 8 months, except when he needed me to sign something. I opened it. He was wearing his work coat, the good one, which meant he wanted me to see him as a professional equal rather than a son asking for help. He came inside. He did not take off his coat. He told me that a numbered company had purchased his mortgage without his knowledge, which he believed was predatory and possibly illegal, and that he had grounds to challenge the transfer. I offered him tea. He said he did not want tea. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where he had done his homework every night for a decade, and he told me that he was in serious financial difficulty and that he needed my help. He was very careful about how he said it. He did not say he was sorry. He did not acknowledge the conversation in the driveway at Thanksgiving. He framed it as a request between adults for a short-term financial bridge. He said he needed $60,000 to cover the arrears, clear the HELOC gap, and give himself runway to restructure. He said he would put it in writing. He said he would pay me back with interest. I looked at my son across that table. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would want me to do. And then I thought about what she would want me to say. Because those are not always the same thing. I told him I was not in a position to provide personal loans. I told him that if he had concerns about the 44RF Holdings mortgage, he should raise them through his legal representative. He stared at me. He asked me if I was serious. I told him I was always serious. He left without his tea. That was a Wednesday. The following Saturday morning, Renata arrived alone. She sat in my kitchen with her hands folded on the table, and she looked at me with an expression she had clearly practiced, somewhere between vulnerability and accusation. She told me that Daniel was too proud to say certain things, but that she was not. She told me that they had a life together, a home, plans, that none of this was supposed to happen this way. She told me that Gordon had deceived everyone and that it was unfair for Daniel to be the one absorbing the consequences when he had simply trusted the wrong person. She said family was supposed to mean something. I agreed that family meant something. She took this as encouragement and leaned forward. She told me that she knew I had the resources to make this right. She said she had always assumed I was just modest, that underneath the truck and the flannel there was more than I was showing. She said she was not asking for charity. She was asking me to protect what Daniel had built. Then she placed a piece of paper on the table. It was a loan agreement template, printed and partially filled in. The amount was $120,000. It included a clause granting them a right of first refusal on any properties I sold in the next 5 years. I looked at the paper. I picked it up. I looked at Renata, and I asked her very directly who had prepared this document. She said a friend had helped. I asked her if Daniel knew she was here. She hesitated half a second too long. I folded the paper in half. I handed it back to her. I told her that I hoped things worked out for them and that she was welcome to let herself out the way she came in. The part I was not supposed to find out about came 3 weeks later. Barry called me on a Friday afternoon, which he never does. Barry is not a man who calls on Fridays because that is when he watches his grandchildren. He told me he had run into a former colleague of mine, a retired property lawyer from Scarborough, who had mentioned that someone had been asking questions about my estate. Not about me, about my estate, about the structure of my holdings. Whether there was a will, whether I had dependents other than Daniel, what the process would be if I were incapacitated or declared mentally incompetent. Barry told me the person asking these questions was a woman who had described herself as a concerned family member. He told me the property lawyer had declined to provide any information, but that the conversation had unsettled him enough to mention it to Barry. I hung up the phone and sat with that information for a long time. The word incapacitated sat in my chest like a stone. I am not a man who frightens easily. I built what I built by walking toward problems rather than away from them. But when your own son and his wife start asking lawyers about the conditions under which you could be declared incompetent, you understand that you are no longer dealing with bad financial decisions. You are dealing with something that has a different name. I called Patricia that same evening. I told her what Barry had told me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me if I had a health directive on file. I told her I did. She asked me if Daniel was listed as my substitute decision maker. I told her he was. She told me to come to her office on Monday morning. On Monday, we spent 4 hours restructuring my legal affairs entirely. I amended my substitute decision-maker designation, replacing Daniel with Patricia herself and a former business partner in Vancouver as co-agents. I updated my will. I established a trust structure for the majority of my assets that removed them from the direct reach of any future guardianship application. I also called the private security consultant I had used once before on a commercial property dispute in Calgary, and I asked him to document everything he could about the movements and communications of the people relevant to this situation. He asked me how thorough I wanted him to be. I told him I wanted him to be thorough enough that there would be no surprises. There were no surprises. There was, however, one document that changed the temperature of everything. 2 of my investigator sources had identified a meeting between Renata and a notary in Mississauga who had a disciplinary record with the Law Society of Ontario. The meeting had taken place on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after my conversation with Renata at my kitchen table. The notary had a history of preparing documents that required signatures from parties who had not actually been present. The investigator could not confirm what had been prepared. But 3 days after that meeting, a change of address form had been filed with my credit union, redirecting all correspondence to a P.O. box in Oakville that I had never opened. I found this out when I called the credit union to confirm a routine transaction, and the representative asked me to verify my updated contact information. I told her there was no updated contact information. There was a long pause on her end. She escalated me to a supervisor. Within 48 hours, the credit union had flagged the account, reversed the address change, and opened a fraud review file. I asked Patricia to begin preparing for the possibility that this would become a matter for the court. She said she had already started. The insolvency filing came in February. Daniel and Renata filed a consumer proposal under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, listing their combined unsecured debts at just under $180,000 and naming 44 RF Holdings as the primary secured creditor. A consumer proposal, if accepted, would have allowed them to pay a fraction of what they owed over 5 years and walk away from the mortgage obligation. They had retained a licensed insolvency trustee from a mid-size firm and had submitted a financial statement that described their household assets as minimal and their monthly surplus income as negligible. It was a document of extraordinary creative fiction. The financial statement listed their household assets, including furniture and personal effects, at $11,000. It did not mention the original Louis Vuitton luggage set that Renata had purchased on a credit card 10 days before filing. It did not mention the Rolex watch Daniel had transferred to his brother-in-law in December, which I knew about because my investigator had photographed the exchange. It did not mention the ski equipment or the e-bike or the wine fridge or approximately $22,000 in goods that had quietly migrated out of the house in the weeks before the filing. A consumer proposal can be challenged by creditors. As the holder of the primary secured debt, 44 RF Holdings had the right to oppose and to demand a court-supervised examination of the debtor's affairs. Patricia filed the opposition on a Tuesday morning. It was thorough. It was sourced. It was devastating on paper. The hearing was set for April. I dressed carefully that morning. I had owned the suit for 4 years, a charcoal wool blend I had bought from a tailor on Queen Street when I had closed the largest single acquisition in my company's history. It fit well. I paired it with a white shirt, a dark tie, and the one good watch I owned, a simple steel dress watch that had been my father's and that I kept serviced because it still kept perfect time. I drove to the courthouse on University Avenue in my truck. I parked in the underground lot. I walked in through the main entrance the same way anyone would. Patricia had arranged for me to enter the hearing room from a side door, but I told her I preferred to come in through the main hall. I wanted to see the room as it was, not as a stage set. The insolvency hearing room is not a dramatic space. It is beige and fluorescent and smells of recycled air and old paper. The trustee's representative was already seated. Daniel and Renata arrived with their counsel, a woman I had not seen before. Daniel was wearing a suit that was half a size too large and a tie that was the wrong width for the lapels. Renata was wearing no jewelry, which was itself a kind of performance. They sat down. Daniel glanced around the room once and appeared to satisfy himself that I was not there. He was visibly calmer after that scan. He settled into his chair. He arranged some papers in front of him with the deliberate movements of a man who is pretending to be more prepared than he is. Patricia's opposing counsel opened by presenting the challenge to the consumer proposal on the grounds of material non-disclosure and fraudulent preference, meaning assets transferred out of the estate to avoid creditors. She walked through the documentation methodically, the photograph of the Rolex transfer, the purchase receipt for the luggage, the contents of the storage unit in Burlington that had been rented under Renata's maiden name 2 weeks before filing. The trustee's representative was writing quickly. The adjudicating officer asked Daniel to respond. Daniel's counsel stood and made the argument that the items in question were personal effects of modest value, that the storage unit contained household overflow rather than concealed assets, and that the transfer of the watch was a gift unrelated to the insolvency. She asked the court to consider the exceptional circumstances her clients had endured, including being victimized by a fraudulent investment scheme, and to grant the proposal on humanitarian grounds. The adjudicating officer asked if the primary secured creditor wished to address the court directly. Patricia stood. She said that the creditor had a representative present and that he wished to speak. She looked toward the side door. I stood up from the bench where I had been sitting, 4 rows back on the left, behind a family that had come to observe a different matter. I had been sitting there since the room opened. I walked forward. I went through the low gate. I stood beside Patricia. The adjudicating officer looked at me. Daniel turned. He registered my suit first, then my face, and then the combination of the two and the calculation that followed was visible in real time across his features. He looked like a man whose floor has just become a window. His counsel leaned toward him and whispered. He shook his head quickly as though dismissing something. I stated my name for the record. I stated that I was the sole director of 44 RF Holdings, the primary secured creditor in this matter, and that I was also the father of the debtor, Daniel Fraser. I said that last sentence carefully, not with anger, not with grief, just as a fact that the record should contain. Then I addressed the court. I told the officer that the items listed in our challenge represented only the documented layer of the concealment. I told her that the more material issue was a pattern of conduct that had begun well before the insolvency filing, and that included an unauthorized address change filed with my personal financial institution using information my son's household had obtained without my consent. Patricia placed the credit union documentation in front of the officer. I told the court that I had reason to believe that the purpose of that unauthorized address change was to intercept financial correspondence in order to identify opportunities to make claims against my estate under a scenario in which I might be declared mentally incompetent. Patricia placed the record of Renata's meeting with a notary in front of the officer. I did not raise my voice. I told the officer that I was 67 years old and in full possession of my faculties. I told her that I drove myself here this morning in a truck I have owned for 12 years, that I read every document in this proceeding without reading glasses, and that I built the company whose debt we are discussing from a single property purchase in 1989, using a 6% fixed mortgage and $400 of personal savings. I told her that the $32 million in verifiable assets held by RVF Properties and its subsidiaries had been built entirely through legitimate commercial real estate investment over 4 decades, and that not $1 of it had ever come from my son, though I had spent considerably more than that ensuring he never went without. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are not usually quiet. Daniel had stopped moving. He was staring at the table in front of him. Renata was staring at me. Her expression had passed through shock and come out the other side into something flat and calculating. The look of a person doing emergency arithmetic. The adjudicating officer removed her glasses and looked at me directly. She asked me to clarify whether I was asserting that the debtor's household had taken deliberate steps to compromise the mental capacity assessment process as a mechanism for accessing creditor assets. I told her that was precisely what I was asserting, and that I had documented evidence to support a referral to the Law Society and potentially to the police. Patricia placed one final document in front of the officer. It was a communication, recovered by my investigator through lawful means from a device connected to the address in question, in which Renata had written to a third party about the possibility of, and these were her words, getting the paperwork moved before the old man figures out what is missing. The adjudicating officer looked at the document for a long time. She looked at Daniel and Renata. Daniel's counsel asked for a recess. The officer denied it. She ruled from the bench. She denied the consumer proposal in its entirety. She referred the matter of the unauthorized financial account access and the notary engagement to the Law Society of Ontario and to the Financial Crimes Unit of the OPP for further review. She ordered the full outstanding debt to 44RF Holdings to be recognized as unsecured in the event of any subsequent bankruptcy filing, stripping away the benefit they had hoped to negotiate away. She ordered cost submissions by the end of the month. Then she looked at both of them and she said, in the dry and measured tone of someone who has seen a great deal and chooses her words exactly, that she found it difficult to reconcile the picture the debtors had painted of themselves as unsophisticated victims with the evidence of deliberate and coordinated financial maneuvering that had been placed before her today, and that she would be noting this credibility finding in the official record. Daniel stood up. His chair scraped backward. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not even when his mother died. It was not anger. Anger I could have understood. It was the look of a man who has been shown the version of himself that he has been hiding from and who cannot look away from it. He said my name once. Just Raymond. Not Dad. Not Father. Raymond. Like I was a stranger whose name he had just learned. I looked at him. I did not offer him comfort. I did not give him the nod or the hand gesture that a father sometimes gives a son to say, "We will get through this." I picked up my briefcase. I buttoned my jacket. I walked out of the courtroom first. The eviction from the house in Oakville was processed through the Superior Court 3 weeks later. I was not present for it. I had no need to be. Patricia handled the legal mechanics, and a property manager I had used for commercial turnovers coordinated the physical process. I learned afterward from the property manager that Daniel and Renata had removed themselves and their remaining belongings the day before the scheduled enforcement, which I thought showed at least a remnant of dignity. The house required some repair before it could be relisted. There were holes in 2 walls, which the property manager photographed and documented for the security deposit claim. The wine fridge was still there, plugged in and empty. Someone had left a framed print in the hallway that said "Good Vibes," only in gold lettering. The property manager asked me if I wanted it removed or kept for staging. I told him to remove it. I drove past the house once on a Saturday afternoon in May with no particular intention other than to see it. It was a clear day. The new owners, a young couple who had signed the lease the previous week, had already put a welcome mat by the front door and a planter with early pansies on the step. The house looked like a house where people were planning to live honestly. I thought that was appropriate. I did not hear from Daniel directly for 4 months. I was not waiting for contact, but I was not surprised when it came either. It arrived as a letter, handwritten on plain paper. No letterhead, no legal framing. just handwriting that I recognized as his, though it was less controlled than I remembered, more effortful, like someone writing in a language they are still learning to trust again. He was working. He had taken a position with a property management company in Hamilton Junior level, the kind of role that required him to show up at 8 and answer to people he used to consider beneath him. He did not describe it with pride, but he did not describe it with shame either. He described it plainly, which was new. He said he understood now that he had chosen to believe Gordon because believing in Gordon meant not having to admit that everything he actually needed had been available to him through his own effort all along. He said he understood that what he had done, not just to me but to the people he had brought into Gordon's orbit, was something that would take longer than a letter to address. He said he was not writing to ask for anything. He said he was writing because he thought I deserved to know that he understood what had happened and why. He did not apologize for Renata. He said only that they were no longer together and that this was the right outcome and that he took responsibility for the choices that had led to it. I read the letter twice. I folded it and placed it in the drawer of my desk where I keep the things I intend to return to. I did not write back immediately. I let the weeks pass. I thought about Margaret and what she would say. I thought she would tell me that forgiveness is not the same as permission, and that love is not the same as rescue, and that the most a father can do is stay in the conversation long enough for the truth to finally land. I wrote back in July. It was a short letter. I told him that I had read what he wrote carefully. I told him that I was not prepared to pretend the last 2 years had not happened, and that some of what had been done would have legal consequences that were outside my control to reverse. I told him that I had not and would not cooperate with any investigation that sought to criminalize confusion or desperation, but that deliberate fraud was a different matter, and he needed to understand where that line was. I told him that if he wanted to rebuild something between us, it would have to be built like everything else worth having, slowly, without shortcuts, one honest act at a time. I told him that I was still his father, and that this fact was not conditional on his performance. Then I told him one thing I had never told anyone outside of Patricia and Barry. I told him that the day his mother died, I had sat in the hospital parking lot for 2 hours before I could drive home, and that the one thought I kept coming back to was that I hoped I had given both of them enough of myself before I ran out of time. I told him I was still hoping that. I signed it Raymond. Not Dad, not yet. But I left the door open. That is the most honest thing I know how to offer. I did not build what I built by closing off futures prematurely. You watch what a man does with the door you leave open. That tells you everything a letter cannot. If this story found you tonight, please leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and if you have ever had to make the choice between protecting yourself and keeping the door open for someone you love, I would really like to hear about it. Hit the like button if you believe that real wealth is not what you accumulate, but what you refuse to surrender. I will see you in the next one. I've spent a long time thinking about what actually happened in that courtroom, and I keep coming back to the same idea. None of it was really about money. The money was just the instrument. What was actually at stake was something much harder to measure and much harder to recover once it is gone. When Daniel looked across that room and saw me in a suit that cost more than his monthly mortgage payment, I watched him try to recalculate everything at once, and what troubled me most was not the shock on his face. It was the hunger. The moment he understood what I was worth, the first thing I saw in his eyes was not regret. It was appetite. That told me more about what had gone wrong than anything the lawyers had put on the record. I raised my son with every advantage I could provide without advertising it. I kept the money quiet because I had watched what visible wealth does to people around it. It draws out a version of the people you love that you would rather not see. I thought I was protecting him. What I understand now is that I was also protecting myself from having to find out who he was when the stakes were high enough. The insolvency filing made that impossible to avoid. Here is what I believe. Not as a matter of faith, but as a matter of observation built over 67 years of watching how cause produces consequence. A person who has never had to earn their understanding of value will eventually treat everything as expendable, including the people who gave them the most. Daniel had grown up comfortable without ever understanding the architecture of that comfort. And when a man like Gordon Ashby appeared with a shortcut and a polished story, Daniel walked straight toward it because he had never developed the internal instrument that distinguishes real from hollow. That instrument is not inherited. It is built. It is built through effort that is not rescued, through problems that are not solved by someone else, through failure that is allowed to land without a net underneath it. I had spent 30 years catching my son before he hit the ground. I thought I was being a good father. What I was actually doing was preventing him from developing the only thing that would have made him genuinely secure, his own judgment. The letter he sent me in the summer was the first honest thing he had written since he was a child, doing homework at my kitchen table. It did not ask for anything. That absence of asking was the most important thing in it. I wrote back because I believe that a man's capacity to change is the most important thing about him, and I have not yet seen enough evidence to close that account. What I will not do is pretend that love means absorbing whatever someone is willing to do to you without consequence. Real care sometimes looks like stepping back and letting the weight of a person's own choices land on them fully. That is not cruelty. That is the only condition under which genuine growth becomes possible. I told Daniel in my letter that what I wanted from him was not gratitude and not repayment. I wanted one honest act at a time. That is still what I want. Whether he delivers it is entirely up to him. And for the first time in a long time, that is exactly where it belongs.